Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In our previous lecture, we talked about the Enlightenment, an intellectual movement that was sweeping across the Americas in the early to mid 1700s. In this lesson, we're going to talk about another movement that swept across the colonies, in this case, a religious revival known as the Great Awakening. By the early 1700s, institutions of religion in the colonies were growing somewhat rickety. The Anglican church ministers were corrupt and disinterested. The church was in disarray. Even the Puritans resembled the Catholic Church they had once rejected. People still had an appetite for religion, but the service just wasn't there to give them what they were demanding. Now, Jonathan Edwards is a precursor to what becomes the Great Awakening. Born in Connecticut in 1703, educated at Yale, Edwards was a profound philosopher, an astonishing intellect. He preached in Massachusetts and Connecticut in the 1730s. Among his core teachings were that emotions were a valid source of Christian experience, as valid in fact as reading or knowledge. God gave us emotions, so they must mean something. This was a new style of preaching that was vivid and passionate, persuaded emotions. Edwards and those after him filled a need of the colonists. Their religious enthusiasm was stewing, but no one had met their needs to that point. In the 1740s, preachers began to meet those needs. Traveling preachers produced incredible sermons, reducing members of the congregation to tears. If Jonathan Edwards represented the precursor to the Great Awakening, it was a preacher named George Whitfield who represented the Great Awakening at its apex. Whitfield, from England, arrived in the colonies originally thinking that he could establish an orphanage, and he set out giving speeches and sermons to raise funds with that goal. Beginning in 1739, he traveled from Boston to Georgia, all the way up and down throughout the colonies, introducing a new sort of Christianity to thousands of listeners and viewers. He preached against the established authority and the old churches, which weren't meeting their needs. Each individual could meet their own ecclesiastical needs through what he described as a conversion experience. He implicitly struck down those in power who seemed to question whether the masses had the intellect or capacity to satisfy their own religious needs. Others following Whitfield more directly attacked the established clergy and the upper classes. In one 1743 incident, an awakener named James Davenport induced his audience to light a bonfire, and this is a quote, "and burn sundry good and useful treatises, books of practical godliness, the works of able divines, as well as hoop petticoats, silk gowns, short cloaks, cambric caps, red-heeled shoes, fans, necklaces, gloves, and other such apparel." Davenport himself threw his own pants on the fire. Quote, "a pair of old, wore-out plush breeches," unquote, which would oblige him to strut around the fire buck naked until someone put out the fire and put his pants back on. So, they are literally throwing off the trappings of established culture, burning their clothes. So there's a deep symbolism to this, as well as the literal and physical rejection of the established order of things. So, in essence, this is a new form of preaching which arouses the masses. The Awakeners also broke with church traditions of seating in the congregation according to social rank. Normally, the upper classes would walk in late and sit right in the front row, as the lower classes crowded in the back. Now they are preaching in the streets, in the fields, in barns, or in homes. As you see in this picture, they're just kind of all gathered around in a crowd. So there isn't that established order of who sat in what pew. There were even times when women, as one quote said, women, yes, girls, could speak in the assemblies for worship. So what can we make of this movement, the Great Awakening, which swept through the colonies in the 1740s? Well, for one thing, it's among the first national movements that we can describe in the colonies. Again, George Whitfield traveling all the way from the southernmost colonies to the most northern reaches of New England. There were few other things in the colonies up to that point that transmitted all the way throughout the colonies. So we're starting to have this germ of unity among the colonies. It also represented an emotional release. We think about the colonial era and particularly Puritans as these very buttoned up, tightly wound kind of people. Now we're starting to have this release of emotions, gathering of crowds, people sort of chanting and cheering. It's just a new way of expressing their emotions. It also, of course, represents a revolution in the nature of churches in this country. We're starting to see what we might describe as the free market in churches. People can demand what kind of minister they want and what kind of teachings they want, and if they're not getting it, they're going to create it on their own in this kind of movement. There is also a great appeal in this movement to African Americans, and we're going to be talking about slavery much more in the next few lessons in this chapter. But the Great Awakening brought to African Americans a kind of preaching and teaching that they could absorb as well. Literacy was not required. Social rank was not required. So they could participate in this as well. And I think overall, it represents a kind of upsetting of the traditional hierarchy of things. These kind of ministers, this kind of preaching, these kind of teachings don't replicate what people had become accustomed to. The gentry are a bit unsettled by this movement because they're literally not sitting in the same places in the pews anymore. Their literal spot in society is not being observed by this. So this as well is a bit of a wake-up call for the upper classes and the gentry in the colonies from the lower classes. We are here, we are going to speak up, we are going to be heard as well. So there's a real sort of underpinning of revolution in this Great Awakening.